Carney's countermove that no one saw coming. When Donald Trump unleashed his most aggressive salvo yet, slapping an unprecedented 35% blanket tariff on all Canadian goods. He expected Canada to fold. He expected panic. He expected Mark Carney to come to the table with concessions, apologies, and a handshake born from desperation. Instead, Trump got silence. Measured, surgical, unnerving silence. No grandstanding. No retaliatory tariffs. No panic press briefings. What he got was a masterclass in modern leadership and a reminder that the rules of international diplomacy don't belong to him anymore. Because while Trump was playing checkers with a Twitter account, Carney was already 10 moves ahead.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Strategic patience over political performance. Donald Trump governs by the minute. If it won't make tomorrow's headlines, it doesn't exist. Mark Carney, on the other hand, governs by the decade. When the tariff threat dropped with the full weight of presidential drama, Carney's response wasn't immediate because it didn't need to be. The deadline came, August 1st, Trump's artificial red line, and Canada didn't blink. Why? Because Carney understood the terrain. He wasn't going to let a volatile U.S. president dictate the pace or the terms. Instead, he did what real leaders do: assess the data, consulted with stakeholders, and crafted a response designed for impact, not attention. And in doing so, he changed the game. The power of bypassing, building a new trade architecture. While Trump obsessed over punishing Canada, Carney focused on rendering those punishments irrelevant. His solution wasn't noise, it was bypass. Rather than beg for tariff relief or retaliate in kind, Carney accelerated Canada's multi-directional trade pivot. Products that once flowed predictably south into American markets were now being routed to Europe, Asia, and the UK with record speed. Instead of waiting for Washington to reopen its doors, Canada built new doors and walked through them without asking permission. This wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. It sent a message to Trump and the world. Canada no longer lives in America's economic shadow. Multilateral leverage, Canada's new economic firewall. Carney's long game was never about chasing old markets. It was about creating leverage through diversification. Under his leadership, Canada rapidly expanded exports under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, with Europe, reignited new pathways with post-Brexit Britain, and finalized bilateral deals with South Korea and Japan to reroute energy, tech, and agricultural exports. Where Trump built walls, Carney built bridges. And here's the genius. The more Canada diversified, the weaker the tariff hammer became. Because now, when Trump tried to punish Canada, the economic pain didn't just miss, it backfired. U.S. importers scrambled to replace critical materials. American consumers paid more for lumber, aluminum, and pharmaceuticals. And border state governors, facing rising prices and supply delays, begged for a ceasefire their president refused to deliver. Internal fortification, resilience from within. While Trump aimed his fury outward, Carney turned inward and launched one of the most ambitious economic resilience programs in Canadian history. Instead of fueling a cross-border screaming match, he focused on eliminating interprovincial trade barriers, allowing Canadian goods to move more freely and cheaply across the country, investing in domestic production, particularly in sectors like steel, agri-tech, pharmaceuticals, and green energy, funding worker transition programs, ensuring communities affected by U.S. market volatility had support to adapt and thrive. It was less flashy than a tweet storm, but far more effective. By rebuilding capacity at home, Carney ensured that Canada wouldn't just survive without the U.S., it would compete. The Indigenous and Labor Alliance, a united economic front. One of the most powerful and underreported elements of Carney's leadership, his ability to unify disparate voices into a national economic strategy. Labor unions, Indigenous leaders, business associations, provincial premiers, environmental NGOs, all were brought into the fold, not as props, but as partners. Carney's economic roundtables became forums of unity, not division. Decisions were made with inclusion, not imposition. And the result? A national strategy with real buy-in, able to withstand both foreign pressure and domestic turbulence. This wasn't politics, it was governance. Trump's tariffs backfire. Again, let's be clear, Trump's tariff war hurt Canada, but it hurt America more. U.S. home builders face skyrocketing lumber costs. Construction firms struggle with copper and steel delays. Automakers relying on Canadian parts slow production, triggering job losses in Michigan and Ohio. Grocery bills ticked up thanks to disrupted agricultural trade. And all the while, Trump bragged about strength while his own economy strained under the weight of his decisions. Meanwhile, Carney stayed focused, quiet, composed, uninterested in ego, obsessed with outcomes. And slowly, the tide began to turn, not through confrontation but through competence. A new kind of leadership in an age of noise. We live in an era where spectacle is often mistaken for strength, where social media outrage is confused with power, where shouting the loudest seems like leadership. But Mark Carney is proving something else entirely. Real leadership is quiet, strategic, and built to last. He doesn't need to dominate headlines. He just needs to dominate outcomes. He doesn't sell fear. He sells plans. And while Trump's administration scrambles to undo the damage it created, Carney's Canada is charting a path forward, independent, confident, and increasingly admired on a global stage. The global echo, Canada becomes a model. What began as a bilateral conflict has now rippled outward. Nations from Scandinavia to Southeast Asia are watching Canada's playbook and taking notes. They see a country standing up to erratic power, not with defiance, but with discipline, not with retaliation, but with resilience. In the process, Canada is redefining what it means to be a middle power. It's not about GDP size or military might. It's about adaptability, alliances, and the ability to chart your own course without being coerced. Carney isn't just leading a country. He's setting a global precedent. He sees beyond a 24-hour news cycle and governs for the long term. Every action he takes is part of a broader transformation, one that doesn't just protect Canada from U.S. instability, but prepares it for an unpredictable global economy. And the core pillars of that vision? Sovereignty through diversification, strength through unity, resilience through investment, stability through discipline. This isn't about surviving Trump's latest tantrum. It's about ensuring Canada never needs to beg the White House for economic access again. It's about transformation, permanence, freedom, conclusion, the bypass heard around the world. Trump thought he could corner Canada with a 35% tariff. Instead, Mark Carney cornered Trump with foresight, planning, and quiet confidence. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't escalate. He bypassed. And that bypass didn't just circumvent a tariff. It exposed the hollowness of Trump's economic nationalism. It revealed the cost of governing by ego instead of expertise. And it showed the world what's possible when a nation commits to vision instead of vanity. Donald Trump has always viewed international trade as a zero-sum game. Someone wins, someone loses, someone dominates, someone gets played. And in his crude calculus, Canada was supposed to be the pushover, the polite neighbor who says sorry even when they're wrong, the smaller economy that needs access to the U.S. market more than the U.S. needs anything in return. But that's the fatal miscalculation that has cost the United States more than just economic leverage. It's cost them credibility. What Trump and his team never understood was that Canada's politeness is not weakness. It's restraint. It's diplomacy. It's the ability to absorb the blow without flinching and then respond with decisions that sting far more deeply than any retaliatory soundbite. Trump expected panic. Carney delivered preparation. And as the months passed, it became clear that Canada wasn't playing defense. It was building an alternative. The infrastructure of independence. One of Carney's least flashy, yet most consequential moves was a national mobilization to rebuild trade infrastructure. Rail routes were expanded and redirected toward eastern ports to handle new export flows to Europe. Western terminals received accelerated funding to accommodate LNG shipments directly to Asia. Rural road systems were upgraded to connect production centers to international shipping points without needing U.S. border access. Carney knew that bypassing tariffs wasn't just about signing new agreements. It was about physically reorienting the flow of goods and money. And while Trump was tweeting about ungrateful allies, Canada was rerouting its economy away from him, kilometer by kilometer, port by port. Infrastructure is power, and Carney was using it like a scalpel, a domestic supply chain revolution. But Carney didn't stop at trade routes. He knew true resilience couldn't come solely from external realignment. It also had to be internal. That meant a deep and aggressive push to rebuild Canada's internal supply chain ecosystem and finally address structural vulnerabilities that had been ignored for decades. Interprovincial trade harmonization. By breaking down outdated regulations between provinces, Carney opened up billions in potential GDP that had been trapped behind bureaucratic bottlenecks. Repatriating critical manufacturing. Canada began rapidly scaling domestic production of medical supplies, agri-tech equipment, electric vehicle parts, and even aerospace components, industries long treated as too small to matter in the global game. Energy independence meets export opportunity. With new investment in hydro, LNG, and nuclear innovation, Canada wasn't just future-proofing its energy grid. It was turning energy into a diplomatic tool. This wasn't just reaction. It was reinvention. The human side, how Canadians were protected. One of the most overlooked successes of Carney's approach was how Canadian workers and families were insulated from the chaos. While Trump's terror blitz caused chaos in the U.S. economy, job losses, higher prices, delayed production, Carney's steady hand kept Canadian industries afloat. Wage subsidies were quickly deployed for sectors temporarily impacted by trade disruptions. Export transition grants helped small and medium businesses access new markets and digitize their operations. Labor retraining programs empowered workers from threatened sectors to transition into Canada's emerging industries: tech, green energy, precision manufacturing. It wasn't perfect, but it was proactive, not reactive. And it proved a core tenet of Carney's leadership. An economy is only as strong as its people. If you protect them, they'll carry the nation through any storm. From dependence to discipline, a cultural shift. Trump's gamble was built on a dated assumption that Canada needed the United States more than the United States needed Canada. And to be fair, that used to be true. The U.S. was Canada's primary trading partner. Over 70% of Canadian exports flowed south. Many of Canada's industrial sectors, automotive, aerospace, agriculture, had been designed around the gravitational pull of the American market. But Carney saw this dependence as a strategic liability and used the tariff crisis to break the addiction. This wasn't just about economics. It was about mindset, sovereignty, national pride. Canada, under Carney, began to see itself not as a junior partner, but as an independent global actor, a country that could lead in AI, energy, green tech, finance, not by begging for American access, but by building a world-class economy on its own terms. Trump tried to squeeze Canada into submission. Instead, Carney used the pressure to forge a stronger national identity. Trump isolated, losing ground abroad and at home. As the months dragged on and the impact of the 35% tariffs became clear, Trump found himself increasingly isolated, not just internationally, but within his own country. Border state governors grew restless as manufacturing output declined. Farmers lashed out over input shortages and rising costs on Canadian agricultural machinery and fertilizers. U.S. energy firms complained that Canada's direct-to-Asia LNG routes were undercutting them in overseas markets. And while Trump kept hammering economic nationalism at his rallies, the actual economy was giving him a cold shoulder. Meanwhile, Canada's quiet victories piled up. New trade volumes with Asia surged. Foreign investment in Canadian infrastructure boomed. European officials praised Canada's stability while privately expressing doubt about America's reliability. The difference couldn't be clearer. Carney was creating new opportunities. Trump was burning old bridges. The world takes note. Carney as global statesman. What began as a bilateral standoff soon morphed into something much larger. Mark Carney's leadership became a global case study in how to resist economic aggression without resorting to chaos or surrender. Think tanks in Europe published white papers on the Canadian bypass model. Emerging Economy studied how Carney mixed trade diversification with domestic industrial policy. Multilateral organizations cited Canada's inclusive governance and data-driven strategy as a template for resilient democracy. And in the global south, where many countries are tired of being held hostage to great power games, Carney's calm defiance of the Trump doctrine earned admiration and respect. This wasn't just about Canada anymore. It was about what any middle power could achieve with leadership that refused to be bullied, bought, or broken. A blueprint for the future. If there's one thing the saga revealed, it's that strength doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from focus, vision, the ability to say no and build something better instead. That's exactly what Mark Carney delivered. A trade architecture that moves beyond one dominant partner. A domestic economy less vulnerable to foreign policy swings. A social compact that protects workers, not just profits. A diplomatic strategy rooted in collaboration, not capitulation. And perhaps most importantly, a lesson to future leaders. Resilience is not a reaction, it's a decision. Donald Trump launched a tariff war to assert dominance. Mark Carney turned it into a moment of national transformation. Where Trump used pressure, Carney used principle. Where Trump escalated, Carney elevated. One of the most important, yet underappreciated, distinctions between Mark Carney and Donald Trump lies in how they think. Trump is the showman, the provocateur, the dealer trying to win today's optics battle. Carney? He's the institution builder, the economist who sees economies as ecosystems, not casinos. Trump launches policies like fireworks, loud, brief, and often pointless. Carney constructs systems, silent, durable, and impossible to uproot overnight. While Trump basked in the headlines of his 35% tariff, Carney was already mobilizing Canada's public institutions, from Export Development Canada to the Canada Infrastructure Bank, from provincial economic development agencies to private sector accelerators. The goal wasn't just to weather the storm. It was to convert the storm into momentum, regulatory reforms, clearing the bottlenecks. In Canada, economic independence isn't just about trade. It's about the internal machinery of government working efficiently. And Carney knew that if Canada wanted to pivot from dependence to resilience, it had to untangle its own mess first. So, while Trump ranted, Carney quietly cut red tape, accelerated approvals for clean energy projects and cross-provincial logistics hubs, national harmonization of transportation regulations to streamline export routes, strategic relaxation of zoning, and industrial permitting to fast-track domestic manufacturing capacity. These weren't camera-ready announcements, but they unlocked billions in dormant productivity, making Canada more competitive, not just internationally, but within its own borders. In the Trump era of government buy slogan, Carney's administrative precision looked like a different universe, because it was the currency of credibility. In a world increasingly weary of unpredictability, credibility has become a form of economic capital. Mark Carney, a former central banker with decades of international trust behind him, wielded that credibility like a diplomatic weapon. When he spoke with world leaders, CEOs, or institutional investors, he didn't need to shout. He just needed to show up. And that matters. Because in 2025, markets don't fear tariffs. They fear instability. Under Trump, Washington became the global epicenter of unpredictability. Tariffs announced by tweet. Trade deals shredded mid-negotiation. Agreements made one week and reversed the next. Meanwhile, Carney's Canada became a sanctuary of reliability, predictable regulatory frameworks, stable diplomatic tone, long-term investment signals that transcended political cycles. This made Canada not just an alternative, but a desirable one, a country where businesses could plan, not just react, and that, more than any retaliation, hurt Trump's agenda the most: the fall of U.S. leverage. The dirty secret of Trump's trade war with Canada is that it exposed how little real leverage the U.S. has left when it alienates its allies. For years, the U.S. got by on the size of its market. Access to America was the carrot waved at friends and foes alike. But in 2025, that carrot is rotting, and Trump's tariff policies turned it into a stick. But what happens when the stick breaks? Under Carney, Canada proved that you can walk away from a lopsided relationship and still thrive. And as soon as Canada walked, others noticed. If Canada, a country of 40 million, could stand up to the American market and not collapse, then what excuse do larger or equally integrated economies have? Trump didn't just lose Canada's loyalty. He cracked the illusion of America's indispensability, an economic renaissance, not a retreat. Let's be absolutely clear. Carney's approach was never about isolation. It wasn't about retreating into protectionism or walling off the Canadian economy. It was about redefinition. Redefining trade not as dependence, but as choice. Redefining sovereignty not as separation, but as negotiating power. Redefining Canadian identity, not as America's polite neighbor, but as a mature global actor with capacity to say no and the strength to say yes on its own terms. Carney used Trump's aggression as fuel for an economic renaissance, modernizing supply chains, unlocking domestic productivity, and restoring a sense of ownership over national economic destiny. It's not just about resisting. It's about reimagining. The social compact strengthened. Carney also understood that trade policy isn't abstract. It touches people, workers, farmers, business owners, consumers. Every shift in tariffs, every redirected shipment has a real-world impact. So while Washington played games with livelihoods, Ottawa under Carney built a new social compact. Targeted support for rural exporters hit hardest by U.S. disruptions. Educational investment in trade literacy for small businesses navigating new markets. Indigenous economic partnerships formalized through procurement programs and investment guarantees. Carney knew resilience wasn't just GDP numbers. It was social cohesion. And in turbulent times, that cohesion became a source of national power. The international backlash against Trump's chaos. As the months rolled on, it became obvious the world had had enough of Donald Trump's chaos. European leaders, once cautious in public, began to openly criticize the White House for its destabilizing trade behavior. Latin American economies quietly began aligning more closely with Canadian export corridors. Even Asian economies, traditionally hesitant to antagonize the U.S., began inviting Canada to new trade forums and energy discussions. All because of one thing, Carney's credibility. Where Trump sowed suspicion, Carney built bridges. Where Trump demanded loyalty, Carney offered partnership. And the contrast was so stark. Even American officials began questioning whether their trade war had cost them not just allies, but their influence. Canada's psychological breakthrough. Perhaps the most important change wasn't economic. It was psychological. Canada, for generations, has wrestled with an inferiority complex in its relationship with the U.S. bigger population, louder media, stronger military. Washington often dictated the tone, and Ottawa followed cautiously, diplomatically, with deference. But Carney's era shattered that model. For the first time, Canada made a definitive psychological break from the idea that it must define itself in contrast to the U.S. Instead, it began defining itself for itself. That shift is cultural. It's generational. It's irreversible. And it will shape the next half-century of Canadian policy. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Trump left behind. As Canada stepped forward into a global role with newfound confidence, Donald Trump found himself increasingly isolated in his own fantasy, still clinging to slogans, still issuing threats, still boasting of deals that never materialize, while the world moved on, while Canada moved forward, and while Carney, the economist, the statesman, the reluctant but commanding leader, proved that quiet competence beats loud chaos every time. Final word, the era of economic maturity. This story isn't just about a trade dispute. It's about a global shift in how we define power, leadership, and national identity. Mark Carney's response to Trump's tariff war wasn't a tactical win. It was a strategic evolution, a moment where middle power took the hits, absorbed the lessons, and emerged stronger, more focused, and more independent than ever. Trump threw tariffs. Carney threw away the old playbook.